It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hume. On the programme this week, MPs challenge the government over preparations to deal with the heat wave.
This is the climate emergency. This is exactly what we were told would happen.
But some peers think it's all an overreaction.
Shouldn't we get a sense of proportion here and recognise that the people being held up at airports are all trying to get to countries where it's even hotter?
Supporters defend Boris Johnson despite his imminent departure.
I remain completely loyal to him to the very end, as I remained loyal to Mrs Thatcher. And I think we will ask ourselves, what have we done? What have we done to a man who gave us this 80-seat majority?
I want to thank everybody here and hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
A standing ovation from some at Boris Johnson's final Prime Minister's questions. Now, with the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments in recess already, we will be staying in Westminster for our parliamentary roundup. At the beginning of the week, we saw record temperatures in the UK with 40 degrees centigrade seen for the first time. It's been a sweltering week here in Westminster, of course. Susan, what was the reaction to all this heat in Westminster?
Well, first, rather shockingly for traditionalists, the first reaction was from the Speaker, who said that people didn't need to wear jackets and ties in the chamber, so that was a bit of a departure. Of course, not even Labour would suggest that the government could actually turn the temperature down. However, there were lots of questions which really fell into two camps. There were questions about what the government was doing here and now to cope with this heat wave. For example, on those rails that are buckling and lots of the trains had to be stopped, pressure on health services, and of course the wildfires that broke out. However, there was another tranche of questions which looked at the bigger picture, that was concerned about the greenhouse gases that are warming the climate and that it is a clear and present danger. So was the government, were those leadership contenders talking enough about that in this leadership contest? It is a huge issue. The Minister acknowledged that, and as he was saying, the summer isn't over yet.
The Met Office, however, stresses that the summer is likely to bring further hot weather and wildfire risk remains elevated. That is why we're treating this heatwave as an exacting test of our national resilience and contingency planning. As always, Mr. Speaker, there is no room for complacency. We have seen over the last few days what you can achieve when you prepare properly and then work closely together.
For too long, Mr. Speaker, our public servants have been underappreciated and undervalued by this government. The Minister mentioned our fire services. Over the last 10 years, their funding and staffing of the fire and rescue service has been cut and response times have gone up by 8%. But as we've seen over the past week, the leadership contenders are doing their hardest to outbid each other on how they would cut action on climate change. They will leave us vulnerable to more freak natural disasters.
As we saw, Mr. Speaker, in all manner of areas of the function in our country, the plans that we have in place worked well. The capacity that we stood up flexed brilliantly often to deal with this ever-changing situation. And as I say, most of the country got through it in good shape.
This is the climate emergency. This is exactly what we were told would happen if we didn't change our ways. Exactly. This is what COP26 was all about. And that's why those who are still part of this Tory leadership race cannot, must not, renege on their commitment to achieving net zero in return for securing votes from the party's base. So could the Minister tell me, where is the plan?
I'm sure he is aware that as far as building resilience into our infrastructure, we do have a national adaptation plan. And as we go through periods like this, particular heat wave, we need to learn the lessons and adjust that plan accordingly. So, for example, there's been much debate over the last 24 hours about the impact on the rail system and what tolerances we build our railways to.
The morale within the fire and rescue service is at an all-time low, and this week the government offered the members of the fire and rescue service a paltry 2% pay increase. Absolutely outrageous to offer men and women who the Minister says was running towards the inferno yesterday. 2%. Minister, it's time we stop clapping the great members of fire and rescue service and start paying them.
We can wave our puny fists at the forces of nature, but the fact of the matter is it's not working. Would we not be far better, instead of spending money on expensive attempts to decarbonise, to spend that money on adapting to the inevitable changes in our climate to make people safe when we have either extreme flooding or extreme heat?
I would urge him to be more optimistic about the impact that human ingenuity can have on solving the world's problems. We have seen throughout our history that the invention of technology in this country, once established and proven to work, often accelerates progress in other parts of the world.
So that's what some MPs in the House of Commons had to say about the heat wave, Susan, but there was quite a different reaction in the House of Lords.
Yeah, the Lords, I'm bound to say, were asking their questions really at the beginning of the heat wave. But there were a couple of peers, interestingly, who took a very dim view of all the fuss, really, and they were wondering why all the blood-curdling warnings. We've had sunny days before, and their reaction was really the only emergency strategy you needed was more ice lollies.
At the risk of making myself unpopular, does my noble friend not think that there's something of an overreaction to 2 days of extreme temperatures? I remember the summer of 1976. I remember it because that's when I proposed to my wife, who I've been married to for 45 years. And we had 2 months of very extreme temperatures, and somehow we didn't have people going out painting the rails white and people not turning up for work and airlines not operating. So shouldn't we get a sense of proportion here and recognise that the people being held up at airports are all trying to get to countries where it's even hotter?
I've been banging on and boring on about climate change for 30 years, and firstly it was considered a rather eccentric obsession. But, my lords, the government's reaction, this is extraordinary. This is not a nanny state. Does my noble friend think anybody doesn't understand that if you're getting dehydrated, you drink water? If you're hot in the sun, you get into the shade. Everybody knows that. We don't need to have an industry pursuing it, and I agree entirely with my noble friend Lord Forsyth. Does he agree?
My Lords, I agree with the common sense advice that my noble friend gives. I think the people of this country, the British people, are a wise people, just as they are a generous people, and I think they are perfectly capable of taking common sense measures. Yeah, yeah. But, my Lords, there is no harm in those in positions to advise, whether it's in the health service or elsewhere, giving health advice. For example, heat can be specifically dangerous with those with particular cardiovascular conditions. And, my Lords, there needs to be a mix, but ultimately we rely on the common sense and good sense of the British people.
Many of us in your Lordship's House are of a significant age. Now, the message that's being given in the media and generally is one of serious danger to the elderly and of excessive deaths. Could the message be reframed, and could the Minister ensure that the message is reframed to put the emphasis on the simple things that you can do rather than to frightening people from being able to continue with their normal lives?
I strongly agree with that, my Lords. I deplore Project Fear in any form when it comes up, and I think that the noble Baroness is absolutely right that we need simple measures, you know, and it doesn't necessarily need to be told by government, walk in the shade, drink plenty of water. These are the things that one can do to make things better for the individual. Ultimately, it comes down to the individual and how they cope, and older people do have difficulties. But, my Lords, I'm conscious that standing here as the Minister for Heat, I have been the successor to Mr Dennis Howell, who was Minister for Drought not long ago. So I confidently hope there may be some water tomorrow falling from the skies.
Some peers getting rather hot under the collar about heatwave advice there. But back in the House of Commons, Boris Johnson is obviously on his way out of Downing Street. But on Monday, the government held a vote of confidence in itself. What was that about? What prompted it?
Well, even although Boris Johnson has resigned as Conservative leader, he does stay on as Prime Minister till September when there's a successor. Opposition parties were not happy about that, felt he should go straight away. So the week before, Labour had called for a vote of confidence in Boris Johnson as the leader. The government rejected that vote of confidence. They're not really meant to, but they did. And instead, they brought forward a motion that talked about confidence in the government as a whole. Now, why? If you think about it, it's much easier for Conservative MPs who are not fans of Boris Johnson to rally around a vote of confidence in the government if there's no mention of Boris Johnson down on the paper there. It was kind of a manoeuvre that managed to take the heat out of it, which is what they needed because they didn't want to see a Conservative rebellion. I mean, if you lose a vote of confidence, that's serious stuff. That's pretty much a general election. So it didn't get to the political drama of that, although Labour were furious that their idea had been foiled. Boris Johnson opened it himself, and he used it, as he has a lot of these occasions since his resignation, to list what he feels are his achievements, and so maybe his own side see what they're missing.
I have no idea why the Leader of the Opposition has insisted that we must have a confidence motion today when we could be sparing people from online harms. That's what he wanted. We could be fixing the defects in the Northern Ireland Protocol, ending pointless barriers to trade in our country. But since he wants one,
order. Might be just helpful. It's actually the government that's put it down for today.
He wants one, Mr. Speaker, and since they want one, well, it's his constitutional prerogative. We will comply. I would remind him of how we began when Parliament was deadlocked and he was shadow Brexit Secretary, Mr. Speaker, and Labour were the first opposition in history to be absolutely petrified of calling a general election. And when they finally capitulated and agreed to submit to the verdict of the people, we sent the great blue Tory ferret so far up their left trouser leg they couldn't move. We won the biggest Conservative victory since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. We won seats they never dreamed of losing, and we, from Wrexham to Workington, from Bishop Auckland to Barrow, we turned red car, blue car, Mr. Speaker.
I personally think that our party is making the same mistake that the Labour Party made when they knifed Tony Blair. But may I say to my honourable friend, is he aware that the excess death rates in Europe show that thanks to his early intervention with the vaccine, fewer people died in the United Kingdom than the majority of other European countries? And thanks to my right honourable friend's intervention, Kiev is still a part of Ukraine and not a part of Russia.
I thank him very much, and I think he's absolutely right in what he says about the record of the NHS, the record of this country in beating back COVID. And what a pity it was that the right honourable gentleman opposite, the Leader of the Opposition, came so many times to this place and said that we had the worst record in Europe. He's never taken it back, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps he'll do so in the course of the debate to come. Some people will say, as I leave office, that this is the end of... They will say this is the end of Brexit. They will, oh yes, listen to deathly hush. Deathly hush. And the Leader of the Opposition and the deep state will prevail in its plot to haul us back into alignment with the EU as a prelude to our eventual return. And we on this side of the House will prove them wrong, won't we?
The delusion is never-ending. What a relief. What a relief for the country that they finally got round to sacking him. And in many ways, the chaos of the last fortnight is familiar. The third Tory leadership contest in 6 years. The latest bumper summer for graphic designers and brand managers. The latest parade of pretenders promising unfunded tax cuts. Latest set of ministerial jobs handed out on a wink and a shake in return for a nomination. And TV debates so embarrassing that even the contestants are pulling out. Every other year they switch out a failed Prime Minister. It's like a once secure Premier League side burning through managers as they slide inevitably towards relegation. But, Mr. Speaker, the end of the season can't come soon enough. This is not the summer for Downing Street to be occupied by a vengeful squatter mired in scandal. Mr. Speaker, every day they leave him there. Every hustings they refuse to distance themselves from his appalling behaviour. And every vote they cast today to prop him up is a dereliction of duty.
The Tories have stayed with this Prime Minister until the bitterest of ends, and today proves that they're staying with him still. Their failure to get rid of the Prime Ministers means that we now finally need to get rid of the lot of them, because today proves another thing. The only fresh start we need, the only fresh start that will work, is a general election.
I have heard a speech from the Leader of the Opposition which, in terms of vituperation and insult and sheer nastiness, I don't think I've ever heard anything like it before, certainly in terms of a Prime Minister who will be leaving office in a very few weeks. Where is any sense of kindness or magnanimity? Why do we need to throw these insults around and claim, I'm just going to proceed if I may, and claim that this is the worst sort of mass murder and criminal in political history? It's complete rubbish. So, speaking for myself, I wholly regret the departure of this Prime Minister, and I remain completely loyal to him to the very end, as I remained loyal to Mrs Thatcher. And I think we will ask ourselves, what have we done? What have we done to a man who gave us this 80-seat majority?
He has debased the high office of the British Prime Minister, and he has shattered the public's trust in our politics. But he didn't act alone. For 3 years, those on the benches opposite have backed him to the hilt. When he was at that dispatch box telling us there were no parties at number 10, or claiming crime had gone down when it had gone up, they were all there, nodding behind him, nodding along with every word of it. Conservative MPs defended the indefensible and excused the inexcusable. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just the Prime Minister we have no confidence in them, it's all of them.
I pity those on the opposition benches. They have resorted to the petty low of personality politics because they have nothing else. So with this Prime Minister gone, what will they do? We can feel their panic seeping across the floor. Their hate-fuelled, moralistic posturing has made them all vulnerable.
So the race to replace Boris Johnson has, of course, dominated the news as the Conservative Party embarks upon yet another leadership contest. But in the House of Commons this week, there has been important business going on, hasn't there? One issue is to do with the victims of the contaminated blood scandal. Why was that being raised?
Well, this is because there have been calls for the victims of the tainted blood scandal to get an interim payment of £100,000 before any more of them die. Around 3,000 people have died already and thousands more are still infected. At the root of it was haemophiliacs being given factor VIII blood products back in the 1970s and 80s that were imported from the US and were contaminated with HIV and hepatitis C, and also people who got blood transfusions with the tainted blood. Now, however, some people are still living, have been living many years with this terrible, debilitating illness as a result. The man who's meant to be devising a compensation scheme, Sir Robert Francis QC, told a public inquiry last week that he feels that people should get this compensation now, an interim payment before the final settlement, because a lot of them don't have that much time. They need the money now in what has been described as the worst ever treatment scandal in the NHS.
The government have already, and rightly, granted £30 million in interim compensation to the Post Office Horizon IT scandal, long before its public inquiry concludes, and also interim payments on the Windrush scandal, but not on infected blood. Now, given the undoubted urgency, on the 15th of July, Sir Brian Langstaff QC started a 10-day consultation on using his own powers to recommend interim payments ahead of his final report, to which the government will need to respond. Now, it's the 25th of July that deadline is set, and that comes after this House enters the summer recess. And as Mr. Speaker has repeatedly said, this House should hear announcements first. And after decades of cover-up and appalling treatment, what exactly is preventing the Minister announcing today, before the summer recess, that interim payments recommended by their own independent reviewer will be paid? And if not now, when?
The government will need to reflect very carefully on the detailed, very detailed evidence that Sir Robert gave only last week. 2 days of evidence, forensic detail, issues such as scope, the types of benefit, the legal issues, the legislative issues. There's a great deal of complexity and interconnectedness in this particular matter. We want to get it right. We will act as we have done as a responsible government throughout this process, and we'll continue to do that.
Due to the sort of ignorance about HIV and a lack of understanding of how it was transmitted, many people assumed that people with haemophilia were infected with AIDS, and it forced so many people to hide their haemophilia for fear of the stigma and the discrimination. And frankly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, they've suffered enough. And when I joined the Department of Health as a minister 5 years ago, the lady from Maidenhead, the former Prime Minister, announced this inquiry, and still we're here.
These excuses just don't wash. We saw at the beginning of COVID, if government wants to move fast, if there's the political will, it can move very, very fast to take action, and that just has been the opposite of making haste with this issue. For too long, the contaminated blood community has been failed by government, ignored by those who've let the demands of those affected fall on deaf ears. As a result of this delay, tragically, many members of the infected blood community will not live to see the outcome of this inquiry. The longer it goes on, the fewer victims will be around to see justice done. Is that what the Treasury is wanting to happen? Justice delayed is justice denied.
My constituent Nick was infected with Hep C. When he died in 2012, he left behind his partner and a tiny baby. 10 years on, this little girl is about to go into secondary school. These families cannot afford any more delay. Will the Minister today pledge that it's not just the living who will receive interim payments, but that it is those who have been so badly affected by the loss of a loved one over these decades?
Too much time has already been wasted. Too many people have died, and too many of their families have been left to suffer without the compensation and the justice for which they are so richly deserved.
My constituent Linda Cannon lost her husband after he received a blood transfusion which infected him with hepatitis C. My constituent Vera Gaskin has stage 2 chronic cirrhosis of the liver, a serious and lifelong condition which she got through contaminated blood. I have sat with both of my constituents. I have listened to the impact on their lives. I have been raising this for 7.5 years, and we are about to have our 4th Prime Minister. 400 people have died since the inquiry started 5 years ago. Is it the government's strategy to wait for more people to die before they get justice?
It's completely wrong to characterise anyone as waiting for people to pass on. That doesn't do justice to the gravamen of the situation. It doesn't do justice to the officials working on the matter. And I reiterate what I've already said, which is that there are good people working hard to get the right result in this matter, and I hope she will reflect on that.
Now, Susan, on Brexit-related business, the Northern Ireland Protocol cleared the Commons yesterday, but it's still a controversial piece of legislation, isn't it? What came up?
Yes, it certainly is. It's off to the House of Lords now, so I think it will run into some stiff opposition there. Just to recap, the reason for this bill is that when the Brexit deal with the EU was negotiated, it kept Northern Ireland in the EU single market for goods. The reason being so that there wouldn't be a hard border with checks between Northern Ireland and the Republic, very sensitive for the peace process. However, that has meant that there are some checks on goods coming from the rest of the UK into Northern Ireland, and that's really upset unionists. Now, talks with the EU haven't done anything so far to solve this. The government has decided, therefore, or is threatening to take unilateral action, which involves getting rid of some of those checks and changing that Brexit treaty, which it negotiated, of course, with the EU, but feels that some parts aren't working. However, unilateral action against an international treaty is pretty unusual stuff. Critics say that is breaking international law and it's damaging the UK's reputation around the world.
Instead of working to fix the challenges, the genuine challenges that the protocol poses, the government continued to push forward with a bill that disregards the UK's international legal obligations and threatens to throw Britain's global reputation into disrepute, and which also, and we'll be discussing this today, Madam Deputy Speaker, which gives them sweeping powers without restriction. Tearing up binding agreements, threatening to break international law and walking away from the table are not the composites of a good negotiating strategy. They are the hallmarks of a zombie government out of steam, and one which has consistently put their own party squabbles and obsessions before the interests of the United Kingdom and indeed of the people of Northern Ireland.
The honourable member bemoans the fact that Parliament might lose some powers to the government. But in Northern Ireland, we today are faced with the imposition of regulations, hundreds and hundreds of them, over which neither Parliament or the government has any say, nor the Northern Ireland Assembly or Executive, and yet I hear nothing from the opposition benches about that democratic deficit.
We hear a lot about the egregious use of powers and regulations being imposed. We hear very little about what specific powers people don't want to have. I think it's about the volume of lawnmowers and such crucial things like that. But does he agree with me that in fact it's more damaging to democracy that the Northern Ireland Assembly, in which elected members are supposed to address wider issues around health, education, the economy and everyday issues for Northern Ireland, that being withheld creates a far wider democratic deficit?
The bill provides certainty that the elements of the protocol which have developed into problems will no longer apply in our domestic law, and that alongside that, make sure the government can honour its promises to the people of all the communities in Northern Ireland. We will protect that which is working to maintain the economic and social framework, North-South traders and nationalists. We will fix that which is undermining the lives and livelihoods of East-West traders and unionists. This bill is the government's top legislative priority. Given the grave situation in Northern Ireland, it must be so. Negotiations will always remain a possibility, and the bill ensures that implementation of any agreement will not cause further delays.
Susan, as the summer recess approaches, there's always pressure, of course, to rattle through the remainder of a parliamentary agenda. But there was a row this week, wasn't there, about insufficient time being given to one debate in particular. What was that about?
Yes, was it insufficient time or did they not want the debate, which is what some critics had thought. This is all about the UK-Australia trade deal, so we're still on trade. And it's the first free trade deal that the UK has negotiated from scratch since Brexit. And the government says it's a great deal and that it's going to benefit the economy. However, British farmers say it's actually not going to benefit their personal economies because they fear it's going to be very damaging for them, that cheaper produce that's done to lower welfare standards will flood the market and undercut them, put them out of business. Now, before these trade deals are agreed, the the Commons is expected to have a debate and vote about it. It's under a process, forgive me, called the Crag process. I mention it because it comes up in the debate. So just to warn you, steel yourself for a little bit of the jargon. However, there is a timetable for that, and the timetable ran out this week. And MPs, actually across the political parties, were pretty cross about that. They said they'd been promised by Liz Truss when she was Trade Secretary that they would get this debate and vote on it. And that's not happened. They were 12 hours before the time ran out, and there was no sign of it down on the order paper. So they were pretty furious. And they kept suggesting that this was actually the government trying to avoid scrutiny on it. And indeed, the International Trade Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, didn't come along. She sent along a junior trade minister who's actually responsible for another area of trade in any case.
Our Anglo-Australian trade deal will play an important role in levelling up the United Kingdom. It is expected to increase trade with Australia by 53%, boost the economy by £2.3 billion and add £900 million to the wages of hard-working households across our country in the long run. Her Majesty's Government has stated on a number of occasions that the agreement will be ratified only once it has passed its statutory scrutiny period under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, and in addition, the necessary implementing legislation must have passed.
This is, Mr. Speaker, the first trade agreement, the first whole new trade agreement we have signed since leaving the European Union. But unfortunately, we have not had the scrutiny we deserve. Mr. Speaker, the then Trade Secretary, now Foreign Secretary, on the 8th of October, said we will have a world-leading scrutiny process comparable with Australia, New Zealand, Canada and Japan. That will mean the International Trade Committee scrutinising a signed version of the deal and producing a report to Parliament. A debate then taking place, and through the Crag process, Parliament can block any trade deal if it is not happy with it. I ask the Minister, are they still committed to that point of principle? Because it has been said by the member for Chelsea and Fulham, it has been said by the member for Banbury, it has been said by the now Secretary of State for Trade. These are commitments that were made to this House, to right honourable and honourable members, and we deserve our say on a trade agreement that makes a significant difference.
The truth is that ministers are running away from scrutiny. Now, might ministers be running away because of the Select Committee's report stating they lack a coherent trade strategy? Or might the government be hiding from scrutiny because of the chaos at the department itself? Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Yesterday, the Secretary of State was saying of her own Minister of State for Trade Policy that there have been, and I quote, a number of times when she hasn't been available, which would have been useful, and other ministers have picked up the pieces. That's her own minister.
As I said earlier, but perhaps he wasn't listening, this will increase trade with Australia by 53%, boost our economy by £2.3 billion and add £900 million to household wages in the long run. What I think is very, very clear is that the Labour Party today is so focused on process and not focused on securing the benefits for the British people out of Brexit.
This deal will punish the food and farming sectors. That's not my conclusion. That comes from his government's own departmental advice. The civil servants joined the National Farmers Union of Scotland, the National Farmers Union, trade experts and academics. The Prime Minister's former food czar has outlined Australia's, quote, abysmal record on deforestation, animal welfare and climate. The benefits of this deal are pennies compared to the amount we're losing from not trading as much with our EU neighbours.
The truth is, £333 million of exports from Scotland go to Australia. We want to boost that in the years ahead, and this deal is the way that we can do that. He refers to me, of course, as a temp. He might want to look at employment law, because I've been in this role 26 months, and I'm very pleased that we have now secured trade agreements with 71 countries around the world, covering trade worth £800 billion. That's how we're delivering for the British people.
There is much to commend this deal, but many of us made a great number of reassurances to our farmers and food producers that there would be a debate on the floor of this House following promises from that dispatch box. What am I meant to say to farmers across Rutland, Melton, the Vale and Harbour villages when they ask why I was not given a chance to have my say in this debate on this important trade deal?
The Minister is deliberately choosing to miss the point of this urgent question. And however much he grins at the dispatch box doesn't alter that fact. The reality of this isn't about whether this deal is good or bad. It's about the fact this is the first trade deal to come before the House, and about whether scrutiny has been delivered.
Many other deals are on the table at the present moment in time. Is this going to be the form for the future, or are we going to address this after today?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act does provide the basis for treaties to be looked at and ratified. It provides a scrutiny period, so that is the statutory footing on which this sits. We have made additional offers to the House to make sure that the House does have the opportunity to look at deals in the future, and indeed, as the House had the opportunity this time.
And of course, it was Boris Johnson's final turn at the dispatch box at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. What did you make of it?
Yeah, well, let's finish with the goodbye. Boris Johnson was once again, as I was saying earlier, very, very keen to remind the country and his own MPs of what he reckons are his achievements. You can sort of feel that pain that he feels that he's been ousted in the prime of what he was trying to achieve. And also, there were hints, I think, that observers have taken as the idea that he might try and stage a comeback. You can see what you make of it when you hear it yourself. However, it's a cruel world, politics. Keir Starmer, rather than talking that much about the Prime Minister, was quite keen to concentrate on his successors and what they'd been saying, and a lot of the criticism that's come up in that leadership contest so far of the government's record. So he's looking ahead for the attacks on whoever's going to be facing him across that dispatch box in a month or so's time. Boris Johnson is a bit of a showman, of course, so you listen out for some very ear-catching turns of phrase that he had there. Spent a lot of time mocking and mimicking Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, on the other hand, tried, at least at the start, to be nice to him.
Can I start by saying to the Prime Minister that I do know that the relationship between a Prime Minister and leader of the opposition is never easy. And this one's proved no exception to the rule. But I would like to take this opportunity to wish him, his wife and his family the best for the future. Why does the Prime Minister think that those vying to replace him decided to pull out of the Sky debate last night?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not following this thing particularly closely, but my impression is that there's been quite a lot of debate already, and I think the public are having an ample opportunity to view the talent, Mr. Speaker, that any one of which, as I say before, like some household detergent, would wipe the floor I mean, today happens to be just about the anniversary of the exit from lockdown last year. And do you remember what he said? He said, yeah, I'm going to remind him, he said it was reckless. It was because we were able to take that decision, Mr. Speaker, supported by every single one of those Conservative candidates, opposed by him, that we had the fastest economic growth in the G7. We're now able to help families up and down the country. If we'd listened to him, it wouldn't have been possible, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think they'll be listening to him either.
Well, I am impressed he managed to get through that with a straight face, actually. I think the truth is this. They organised the TV debates because they thought it would be a great chance for the public to hear from the candidates firsthand. Yeah. Then disaster struck because the public actually heard from the candidates firsthand. But I am interested in what he makes of the battle for his job. So let me start with a simple one. Does the Prime Minister agree with his former Chancellor that plans put forward by the other candidates are, in his words, I've got them here, nothing more than the fantasy economics of unfunded spending promises?
They know all about fantasy economics because they've have already committed to £94 billion of extra tax and spending, Mr. Speaker, which every household in this country would have to pay for, to the tune of about £2,100. It's thanks to the former Chancellor's management of the economy, thanks to this government's management of the economy, we had growth in May of 0.5%. We have more people in paid employment than at any time in the history of this country, Mr. Speaker.
Inflation is up again this morning, and millions are struggling with the cost of living crisis. And he's decided to come down from his gold wallpapered bunker for one last time to tell us that everything's fine. I am going to miss the delusion. But his Foreign Secretary didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. She also said that the former Chancellor's 15 tax rises are leading the country into recession. And the member for Portsmouth North was even more scathing. She said, again her words, our public services are in a desperate state. We can't continue with what we've been doing because it clearly isn't working. Has the Prime Minister told her who's been running our public services for the last 12 years?
Mr. Speaker, this is absolute. And again, he's doing this completely satirical. This is the government that is investing £650 billion in infrastructure, in skills, in technology. He talks about public services. What really matters to people in this country right now is getting their appointments, getting their operations, fixing the COVID backlogs. That's what we're doing. Fixing the ambulances. That's what he should be talking about, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we voted through. That's why we passed the £39 billion health and care levy, Mr. Speaker, which they opposed. Every time something needs to be done, Mr. Speaker, they try to oppose it. He's just a great pointless human bollard, Mr. Speaker. That's what he is.
On behalf of the people of Ukraine, may I thank him for holding high the torch of freedom and ensuring that that country is not a vassal state. For true grit and determination, keep going and thank you.
I want to thank my right honourable friend, and I want to use the last few seconds, Mr. Speaker, to give some words of advice to my successor, whoever he or she may be. Number one, stay close to the Americans, stick up for the Ukrainians, stick up for freedom and democracy everywhere. Cut taxes and deregulate wherever you can to make this the greatest place to live and invest, which it is. I love the Treasury, but remember that if we'd always listened to the Treasury, we wouldn't have built the M25 or the Channel Tunnel. Focus on the road ahead. Focus on the road ahead, but always remember to check the rear-view mirror. And remember, above all, it's not Twitter that counts. It's the people that sent us here. And yes, the last few years have been the greatest privilege of my life. And it's true that I helped to get the biggest Tory majority for 40 years and a huge realignment in UK politics, Mr. Speaker. We've transformed our democracy and restored our national independence, as my right honourable friend says. I've helped to get this country through a pandemic and helped save another country from barbarism. And frankly, that's enough to be going on with. Mission largely accomplished. For now, I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all the wonderful staff of the House of Commons. I want to thank all my friends and colleagues. I want to thank my right honourable friend opposite, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank everybody here, and hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
And that's it, the beginning of the end of the Boris Johnson show. I don't think Sir Keir Starmer and the Prime Minister are going to miss each other at all. But I thought what was striking to me was that it didn't seem any more dignified or momentous than usual. It normally would when a Prime Minister goes.
No, there was still plenty knockabout. Hasta la vista, baby. It's an unusual final words at the dispatch box for a Prime Minister. And the other thing that I thought was very striking about that was Theresa May reluctantly got up, but she wasn't applauding the man who'd helped to oust her.
Everybody spotted that. Well, the Tories are on to their next leadership contest, which will dominate political coverage through the summer. But, Susan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That is all for Politics UK for this week. With Parliament now in recess, we'll be back in September when we will have a new Prime Minister. Do join us then. Have a lovely weekend.